Okay, well, welcome everyone to the IfM Briefing, COVID-19 Manufacturing at a Turning Point. Today we are joined by four leading experts at the Institute for Manufacturing to hear their thoughts and reflections on the reaction of the manufacturing sector to the COVID-19 pandemic. We will also be holding a panel discussion in the second part of today's event on the future of manufacturing post-COVID-19. I'm Johnny Williamson, and I'm the editor of themanufacturer.com, and I will be hosting the event for you today. For those who may not have heard of The Manufacturer, we are the leading UK industry platform providing manufacturing news, analysis, insights, and best practice case studies. We cover all aspects of manufacturing, and our portfolio comprises events, an extensive roster of digital activities, and our flagship monthly publication. It's great to be partnering on such a topical event with our friends at the Institute for Manufacturing. And again, for anyone who doesn't know, the IfM is part of the University of Cambridge, bringing together expertise in management, technology, and policy to address the full spectrum of issues which can help industry and governments around the world create sustainable economic growth. So let's run through the experts who will be joining us today, our speakers and our panel. First up, we have Tim Minshall, who's Dr. John C. Taylor Professor of Innovation and Head of the Institute for Manufacturing. There's Duncan McFarlane, Professor of Industrial Engineering and Head of the Distributed Information and Automation Lab at the IfM. We have Jag Srai, Head of Center for International Manufacturing at the IfM, and Carlos López-Gómez, Head of Policy Links Unit at the IfM Education and Consultancy Services. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Tim to kick off the opening presentations.
Johnny, thank you very much for that. I hope everybody can hear me okay. We're delighted to be running this webinar today. And I've got about 10 minutes to present one aspect of this idea of how the manufacturing community has responded to this extraordinary crisis. And I guess we can think about what's been going on in terms of things happening in the middle of the crisis, things happening as we exit the crisis, and things that will be happening afterwards, the repositioning of manufacturing potentially in response to what's been happening, and other factors too. But I'm, in this bit, just going to focus on something that happened right in the middle of the pandemic, what's happening over the last couple of months, before colleagues will be dealing more with the issues of how we emerge from and how we deal with what's going on afterwards. So what I'm going to do is just cover, three aspects of what can be broadly called repurposing. So in the midst of this extraordinary crisis, as I'm sure everyone saw very clearly, there was a fantastic response from the manufacturing community, locally, nationally and internationally, to a, I hate to use the word, but it is an unprecedented series of challenges. So what we've been doing is trying to make sure that we can not only help where we could, but also to capture knowledge about what was going on so that lessons can be drawn for ensuring our greater resilience in the future, hopefully never facing something like this again though. So what I'll do is talk about three specific examples of repurposing activities that happened in relation to manufacturing, responding to specific COVID challenges. And then I'll try and draw together from this a few lessons, both specifically about manufacturing in our healthcare system, but also some generic lessons, which will then lead in to the speakers who are going to follow me. So maybe just to make one very important point, we've been helped a lot in capturing all this data by a great group of people who are named here, many others as well. But I'd particularly like to thank Georgia Semple and Carl Magnus von Baer for providing some of the content for this presentation. So first of all, this issue of national level response to the crisis. So a great example we've seen in the UK is that of the response to the actual and perceived shortage of ventilators, which I'm sure many on this webinar will know much more about than I do, but I just wanted to use this as an example of one type of manufacturing response to the COVID crisis. So we just have to position ourselves back to how things were back in the first quarter of this year and just remind ourselves the massive width of the error bars on the uncertainties facing the UK. We'd seen what had happened in Wuhan, we'd seen what was happening in North Italy, we were seeing what was happening in Spain, and there was a palpable sense that we are going to face an enormous healthcare crisis, even bigger than the one we've actually experienced, but a sense that we'd seen what had happened, and a key issue in all of this was people need to be put onto ventilators in order to ensure their survival. The government looked at how many ventilators we had and how many we actually predicted to need in a worst case scenario, and there was a big gap between the two. So 3 options. 1, try and buy more from international markets, but it's a pandemic, so everyone's trying to buy ventilators, there just weren't enough available. Secondly, encourage existing manufacturers to scale up, but that's a major task in its own right. Or, assuming a worst case, can we rapidly design and make ventilators that will be sufficient to allow us to deal with this? So, as many will know, there was a call put out by the UK government for assistance, and literally thousands of companies responded to this. And out of this came a series of initiatives. And to try and simplify it, we'll just focus on the sort of 12 to 14 projects that were initially taken forward. I'm going to put up a slightly complex chart, but I'm going to introduce it in stages, so just bear with me. All you need to look at is the blobs and where the blobs are. So here's a very simple chart that says, look, on that vertical axis up over here, we've got how sophisticated were these ventilators, from very sophisticated, full spec, down to slightly more basic, but still sophisticated. Along the horizontal axis is, were these completely new designs, or were they existing products that had been manufactured? And so our colleague and student Carl Magnus von Baer looked at this and mapped all of the initiatives that were taken forward like this. And you can see there were a range of projects to either make completely new ventilators, bottom left, or to scale up production of existing ones, top right. And the reason for the different colours, something we'll come back to, is conditions changed. What was anticipated was not actually required. And so what we've seen is the existing designs have been at a phenomenal scale and a phenomenal speed scaled up, whereas the products that were completely new weren't after all needed, despite absolutely fantastic efforts to get those designs approved in record time. So that's an example of the manufacturing community coming together to address a very specific problem of a complex medical product. A second bit of repurposing we noticed was what we're labeling as direct. This is when individual NH trusts or groups of NH trusts said, look, we can see this happening. We can see there seems to be either an actual or a perceived shortage, either immediate or in the near future, of PPE. We believe that supplies will arrive from central NHS, but in the meantime, we need to respond to this problem. And so we saw examples across the country of local manufacturing firms teaming up with local healthcare trusts to produce specific goods. They repurposed what they were doing to provide a particular resource for their local or regional healthcare trusts. So direct repurposing between healthcare provider and manufacturing firm. And then the third example we've been capturing is this slightly different approach, which was the community-based ideas, where unlike manufacturing firms, these were just often members of the public, people, school teachers, students, whoever, coming together to say, look, we want to help. We can see there's a shortage of PPE. What can we do about this? And so these online communities formed very, very rapidly. They attracted donations, they got hold of designs, they produced PPE and delivered it to their healthcare trusts. We also saw the repurposing of, for example, university facilities, which of course the students all had to be sent away. So you had all these facilities that could be repurposed. They're not designed for manufacturing, they're designed for prototyping and teaching, but they could be repurposed to make particularly face visors. And then we also saw the make spaces. I'm just picking the example here of the Cambridge make space as one example, where very rapidly they said, well, hang on, we've got this capability to make things. We're hearing a clear signal from the clinicians. Let's do something about that, and responded in an extraordinarily professional way with visors, with clips to make the wearing of masks for long periods less painful, and also for designing face masks. And so these were not guided by the government. These were not manufacturing firms responding to a call. This was communities responding as what's sometimes called part of the citizen supply chain to a particular issue. So the final bit I want to say is, having just introduced briefly those 3 examples, to try and see, are there any generic lessons from this before we then hand over and discuss a broader range of issues relating to manufacturing in response to COVID. So first of all, there's a series of observations we can make that specifically relate to healthcare. And then I'll talk about some that are more generic. Specific healthcare ones we've seen in this COVID crisis at those three levels is, it's been incredibly difficult to match supply and demand. What was really going on? Was there sufficient supplies of PPE in the NHS supply chain and it was just a problem getting it to the right places? Or was there actually a shortfall? But it didn't really matter because people perceived, and in many cases did not receive what they thought they needed. And so something had to be done about this. And so there was a surge of demand for greater supply, and these direct and community projects responded on the PPE side. Balancing the real requirement for ventilators, incredibly difficult to predict that one because of even the highly accelerated lead times on these still meant that when a decision was made to go ahead, it was a long time perhaps from when they were actually going to be needed. So this issue of matching supply and demand proved very, very difficult. We also saw a very key role for intermediaries, such as the High Value Manufacturing Catapult, supporting the Ventilator Challenge UK Consortium, playing an absolutely vital role between those who had the manufacturing knowledge and those who had the particular need. And we saw that also happening places like MakeSpace, and MakeSpaces generally acting as intermediaries between those who wanted to make things and the clinicians who needed them. We saw an important role for the clinical engineers in hospitals, helping make sure that supplies were made to the right specification and the right design. And we also noticed a shift. A lot of the conversation in the beginning was our hospitals need support. But very quickly we saw as the whole long journey, the patient pathway from first symptoms through to returning to the community was realized, it wasn't just about hospitals, it was about the whole healthcare system. And all the way through this, the requirements for things such as PPE were changing. Who needed what equipment, at what time, in what quantity, at what place. But finally, just to draw out some general comments from this, we see something interesting happening around this balance between a crude observation that saying, oh, well, these long supply chains clearly are not working. We should have lots of local manufacturing that would solve it. But of course, the truth is, it's not about long supply chains or local manufacturing or stockpiling. It's actually getting the right balance and doing it in a flexible and agile way. I know colleagues will come back to that later. It's also about this ability to repurpose. It actually could be quite useful in all sorts of other situations. So should we perhaps view this ability to respond, as the motorsport sector and the aerospace sector and the automotive sector did remarkably well? Should we look at that from a national perspective as a real asset? And then finally, this issue of none of that would have been possible if we had a very weak manufacturing base. The fact we had fantastic motorsport technology and automotive technology, precision engineering technology that could be repurposed. And this leads us back to that debate about, this has shown the importance of manufacturing as a common good for an economy, not just for responding to a crisis, but also for ensuring that we can continue to innovate and not just do the R&D, but actually produce products and make the economy to ensure economic growth and also economic resilience. So that's just what I wanted to say at this point as kind of the first presentation, very much embedded within the crisis. At this point, I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Duncan McFarlane, to talk about the role of automation and information. So Duncan, over to you.
Yeah, so thank you, Tim. Tim's made a number of really interesting points about things we've learned across the most recent 3 months dealing with COVID. And there's great things learned, and I think the point that we're going to be making in the rest of the talks is that actually the COVID period is certainly not over by any stretch. And so I'm going to particularly talk about the role that automation and information can play, both in managing the COVID period as it unfolds into the future, but also just looking into beyond that, because there will be life after COVID for manufacturing. So I'm going to begin because I'm a systems engineer, and I always begin with a feedback loop. And I want to do this for a very simple reason. What you see there is the way most automation and information systems work. There's somewhere automation involves decisions, actuations to change an operation, which we do some sensing about, and analyze what we sense in order to change future decisions. So we're going around that loop. And particularly, I want to mention two areas on this loop, because the sensing and the actuation areas, because they're the areas where the physical environment interacts with the information environment. And I think that's an areas where we're going to find lots of challenges for automation and just operating our manufacturing environments over the next year or so. So that's the first point I want to make there. And I've just included a couple of little pictures there. You know, sensing, we often think about sensing as being a complex thing, but the most simple sensing we often do is reading a barcode. And on the right-hand side, actuation in automation systems, people often talk about robots, but switches and things like automated light switches, etc., may well be the type of actuations we're interested in many cases. Second general point to make about automation is that there's some confusion about the differences between automation and digitalization. And in essence, from here on, I'm going to say, don't bother thinking about the differences between the two. Automation historically began looking at automated mechanical operations, and digitalization came about by looking at computer support for manual operations. But increasingly, the two are merging, and pretty soon almost everything we're doing in a digital way will be either automated or semi-automated. So where I use the word automation, digitalization is pretty similar, really. So just 2 points to make before I start to talk about the post-COVID automation information challenges. And I've bundled those under 3 topics. What it means for day-to-day automation in manufacturing operations, the implication of automation information for reconfigurability and how reconfigurability of our systems might help us, and the notion of track and trace. So tracking goods in our supply chains, but also people and assets, and tracing them. And what I should say, I'm not going to talk about this in any detail, but we've just come off a pretty intensive 3-month period where we've been working very closely with local hospitals. And I would say in what I'm going to say in the following 3 slides about these topics, each of them has some connection with experiences we've had in dealing with COVID in the health services sector. So on to automation opportunities. So I'm just throwing up some initial thoughts and also reflections based on conversations with companies we're working with, both very small companies, also quite large companies. The first is that actually there's going to be an increasing emphasis or importance on no-touch, what we call no-touch automation techniques. So now we're paying a premium for any touching, any physical contact with either with people or with equipment, etc., brings into place a pretty considerable cleaning regime. We're starting to be asked to look at issues like voice and gesture, etc., and image processing techniques, which reduce the amount of physical interaction that might be required. And for example, right now we're working with a company looking at a voice-controlled PPE dispensing machine to use in factory environments, which saves anyone having to physically come in contact with the machine itself. Secondly, as we find that we're having restricted people flows in the factory operations, manufacturing operations, remote monitoring is something that we may need to look more carefully at, and that may be making use of some of the techniques associated with Internet of Things, or using other forms of wireless network environments to actually monitor things that we might traditionally require someone to be in place to monitor, but actually doing so from remotely, at least for a period of time, but potentially into the future. And then linked to that is the remote management. So I kind of was, looked at the light switch at the beginning, and opportunities for automating perhaps not core operations, as I say down the bottom there, but peripheral operations that actually don't need someone to be in place in order to ensure that the operation is managed, whether it is turning the lights out or or doing inventory counts, etc. So a number of simple opportunities in automation, all of which in one way or another we're looking at in some of our work here. Then a second comment, which actually I saw on the chat a little bit earlier on, someone making the comment, have we moved away from just in time? Are we now going to have to start to think about building much more stock in order, based on the experiences we've had with PPE shortages? But I think, you know, in a way, coming from some of Tim's comments, that an alternative approach to think is to look at our systems and how reconfigurable they are, and whether we have got rapid response capabilities, either ones that we're aware of, but others maybe that we're not aware of. And are there opportunities for, in these periods where there may be lower demand for some items and higher demand from other items, are there opportunities to produce different products which have a higher shorter term priority? And some of that from an automation context comes down to thinking about our systems a little bit like Lego blocks or jigsaw puzzles, but being able to readily reconfigure them and understand what it means to not just reorganize the physical operation, but the automation and the information systems that support it. And in particular, one of the things that we look at is what's the potential for a system to be reconfigured, but equally how easy and how costly is that reconfiguration. And this might be some of the thoughts that are going through organisations' minds at the moment, where they look at short-term demand needs, whether it's around building up future PPE stocks, but other shortages we're facing, but also potentially trying to consider the potential for future waves of return of, you know, increased numbers of COVID patients, etc. So that's the second point. And then the third one was around tracking and tracing. And, you know, we're seeing a significant number of increases of activities around this. And, you know, obviously on a daily basis, we get updates on the NHS tracking systems and there's a demand for companies to understand how they align their own tracking of staff within their organisations to be in line with the tracking guidelines from the NHS, but also just their own safety procedures and guidelines. Secondly, with assets, it's important to know increasingly where the assets are, whether those assets have moved into different regions or sections of an organisation, because again, we've got cleaning regimes that we may need to impose on assets that are mobile and being used by, interfaced by multiple people. So the tracking of assets is a really important issue. And then thirdly, the whole business of the materials flowing through our supply chains, both tracking, so actually knowing where our supplies are, and Tim sort of mentioned some of the challenges in the PPE supply chain, but also, you know, within the food and other other equipment supplies, there's been some issues around tracking lately. And then the sort of the partner in crime of tracking is tracing, and again knowing where products come from, whether they're our food products, but also any product that may have been handled and passed through areas where they've been exposed to COVID conditions, and also the PPE. A number of the challenges we saw with PPE equipment becoming available is understanding from a traceability point of view whether it's been through the full certification path or not. So there are three challenge areas for automation and information. So the basic automation of operations, reconfigurability, and track and trace. So I'll just finish with three small points. You know, I think it's important to say at this point that, you know, you don't want to go set out to change your business strategy around COVID, but you might want to change your priorities as provided by some of the opportunities. And that feeds into the second point, which is, you know, the ideal thing for an organisation would be to be supporting short-term opportunities that really help them set up better long-term capabilities. And I've seen already people asking about the green impact of some of these changes. And, you know, there's certainly green elements to that, which may be excellent long-term opportunities. And then the other one, which I guess I would say, given that we run this digital manufacturing on a shoestring program, is that there may be opportunities to consider temporary, perhaps low-cost solutions for some of these new developments in order to get started and to try them out and accept that some changes in automation information systems may not last forever, but maybe things that want to be trialled. So on that note, I'll finish the talk on automation and information opportunities and now hand over to my colleague, Jag Srai, who's going to now talk about some of the implications for supply chains.
Good afternoon and good morning to those of you in the Americas. I've just got two inputs really to pick up on, which I'd like to share. I was in Davos in January 2020, where a number of us picked up on what were the challenges facing manufacturing supply chain. So some personal perspectives on what the global uncertainties and risks were at that time. And then very shortly after, we were hit by COVID. And here we're looking at how advanced manufacturing technologies are perhaps driving longer term business model innovation that Duncan talked about. And then a quick wrap up. So you'll perhaps recognize some of the faces here on this chart. And really what I wanted to do was share some conversations that were taking place in Davos in January around internationalism, sustainability. It was great to see Al Gore introduce his thinking to the leading chief manufacturing and supply chain officers and the group working on advanced manufacturing technologies. So three sort of takeaways. First of all, protectionism and global power shifts. There's been a significant change in the way economies have grown, and which countries, in fact, actually observe the conventions we were used to expect. So he points to, for me, a deglobalization of sorts. But for me, the phrase that captures what I think is ahead is a reconfigured internationalism, and we'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. And there, in January, we were talking about the need for shorter, more resilient supply chains. The second area really was around climate change, and it was most definitely the new imperative of the day. And climate change is related to the top 5 global risks in the risk report that was presented there. And as well as the adoption of new technologies, the limitations of how current efforts in addressing climate change would have significant implications on our ability to sustain manufacturing, but also potentially significant social consequences. An example being a projection of 1 billion refugees and migrants expected this century. And the third was really this adoption of advanced manufacturing and digital technologies, which had become the major focus of multinationals. And the thought there was, can we integrate these new initiatives into the sustainability agenda, drawing on individual as well as collective responses here. So some very genuine, in my opinion, ambitious net zero targets from firms, sometimes a 50% reduction, sometimes even a carbon net zero, but also some issues around the transparency of these claims. Can we make these such progress public? And he's getting to net zero using offset based on established standards. And indeed, can we really look at the broader supply chain rather than perhaps outsourcing our carbon reduction responsibilities? And going on to the issue around global risks, you see on the chart on the right in green, the biggest diamonds here were around the green diamonds around climate change and climate risks. So the significant impact that manufacturing has on carbon emissions. In red, you have a number of issues linked to jobs and social issues, unemployment and social instability. And in purple, around technology adoption. And perhaps still in a situation where 72% of tasks are still performed manually. But what was intriguing for me on this chart is, I don't know if any of you can see where infectious diseases is. It was a very small dot on this landscape. So a lot of us had it on the radar, but perhaps not expecting it to be so game-changing. So coronavirus then hit us, and we all are facing some of those consequences. So there's a piece of work with my colleagues from the US, Nitin Jaglaker from Boston University and Jeff Parker from Dartmouth and the MIT Digital Lab, where we're looking at how advanced manufacturing technologies might be actually accelerating business model innovation. And so input to this study was a number of organizations, and you'll see some of the leaders on adoption of new technologies, large manufacturers, and some of the key commentators on the future of manufacturing. But also a number of what I call born digital organizations. You'll see Fast Radius, Bright Machines, who are leveraging technologies that would drive very new business models. I wanted to see how this is going to impact us going forward. So the theme, as I said, was around what are advanced manufacturing and production technologies, how would they shape future operating and business models? And a bit of an interesting debate we had around the operating business model coming together rather than two discrete activities. You know, many CEOs weren't chasing their strategy directors during the crisis, but very much their operating chief operating officers. So we wanted to look at what worked, what failed, what is worth keeping when the crisis is over. Would we go back to a business as usual, or would we be leveraging the mass experimentation at scale that we had observed? And were the resilience measures actually only workable in crisis mode, or could we use them as part of an ongoing sustained activity? So one of the key observations was, ready or not, new business models were impacting companies. 5 years of innovation in weeks was one of many similar quotes that we were observing. And why was this necessary? Why did the traditional stage gate process get thrown out the window? Well, companies were faced with dramatic demand shocks. These were positive and negative. So on the supply side, supply shocks may have been either disrupted, so failure to supply, or actually the failure to take on the opportunity and the inability to scale. Yet other firms were able to change without significant new investment. Those that had adopted new technologies, those had used end-to-end digitalization that connected user requirements with their manufacturing supply chain. And indeed, many firms have already adopted technologies on the factory floor, perhaps not visible to the rest of us. So first, a few words on some of the reported failures. We just clustered them in 4 areas. One was around inflexible human resources. And here we were looking at inability to change the way we operate, perhaps a lack of leadership, widespread infections resulting in labor shortages, some of us overworked and some of us furloughed. And I think we can all have our personal stories to tell on there. Tim mentioned this major demand and supply imbalance, partly linked to large supply chain delays, some linked to stock out and hoarding that we observed, many due to shifts in consumption patterns, major shifts in the way products were being procured and the channels where they were being bought. On the finance side, the lack of liquidity often meant that cash flow problems meant that there was an inability for suppliers to actually meet demand that they had. I think many countries face this inflexible healthcare supply. And one of the issues around leaning of the shop floor, does it actually make us less flexible to changes in demand? Now, Often we talk about digital platforms as an answer to some of these problems, but we found they were inflexible platforms, some had unreliable information, and others a restrictive legal framework. So moving on to what succeeded. And here in this diagram, we're trying to just pick up some of the observations from our interviews on which are the successes in business and operating models. And here you see this schematic where you have the virus trying to penetrate this ring, and what was actually resulting in organizations being resilient was those with production flexibility at speed, providing that protective core, local production capabilities that could be drawn on, supply chain visibility, so you're not vulnerable to a disruption in your immediate supplier, but also in terms of further up and down the supply chain. The ability to leverage global know-how. We talked in some of the ventilator examples earlier, that the ability to share designs and share approaches becomes important. And of course, alternative supply sources. So moving on to what actually provided that resilience. And these are observations where a mix of advanced manufacturing technologies supported that resilience. So Tim had talked about repurposing of manufacturing capacity. Clearly only possible if you have some local production capabilities. Second, the digitalization of supply chains, giving early warning signals around supply and demand changes. One I wouldn't have had thought of is strategic workforce planning, the flexibility of labor within your manufacturing operations. The provision of capital and liquidity. We saw Alibaba and more recently Amazon be step forward to provide the cash for suppliers to support supply chains. Remote infrastructure management, the ability to accept machinery remotely as a part of an acceptance testing regime. Platformization, how digital platforms allow us to mediate between changes in supply and demand. When properly designed, allow that incredible flexibility to draw on alternative supply sources. And finally, reconfiguring manufacturing capability, that reconfiguration potential that I talked about becomes crucially important as well. So a mix of these provide that resilience to future shocks. So for me, it can be simply summarized as digital design, digital production, and digital fulfillment. And aspects of that were pretty evident in those responsive organizations. So just to wrap up my summary thoughts here, operations previously I think has been seen as a cost center, a necessary evil perhaps, not to those on the webinar, but to many policymakers, should be seen as a set of assets that provide options and a primary source of innovation. And we're entering a time where capital may be very scarce. And maybe other than the areas of essential industries that get defined, such as healthcare and possibly food, the case for local just-in-case asset reshoring will be very difficult unless we can offer better products, faster times to market, and more efficient operations. Indeed, these decisions from reshoring to multi-sourcing should be driven by both operating and business model innovation, and advanced manufacturing technologies will underpin those. I talked about digital platforms, but these may span design, production, and fulfillment, and not just the last mile logistics that we often see as consumers. Again, they provide this mediating role between the ability to flex supply and demand. And finally, returning to my introduction, future business and operating models will need to address these trade uncertainties, the climate change issues, the technology adoption strategies with their consequent impact on jobs. So over to you, Carlos.
Thank you, Jag. I think you have my slides now. Then. So good afternoon, my name is Carlos López-Gómez, and I'll be talking to you a little bit about the international policy responses, drawing primarily from a study that we are currently conducting for the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. So thank you to my colleagues at the Policy Links Unit who are working on this. So how can manufacturing emerge stronger from the crisis? First, a little bit about the global context. The world economy is expected to contract around 5%, according to the latest estimates of the IMF. And at the national level, this graph shows you the manufacturing output of different countries, looking at the index of industrial production, a measure of output, and taking 2015 as a reference year. So what we see at the national level is that global manufacturing growth was already decelerating in 2019 due to trade tensions among the big countries. We can see this reflected clearly in China. You see that already coming down. This is the beginning of January, quite significant shock all the way at when the crisis happened, quick shock, but also quick rebound in China. So, you know, compounded effect of different mega trends there, both the trade disputes, but also the COVID-19 lockdown. Countries like Korea, like that you are seeing here, and Taiwan, that didn't really go into lockdown, had a less significant effect. Then you have countries in Europe, export-oriented countries like Germany, for example, that actually have had a significant shock right now and you see a different shape here. The UK is surprisingly similar to Germany, very much intertwined there, as you can see in the graph. So global shock, but very different national effects. That's what we see in the international context. So why supporting manufacturing in the middle of a pandemic? I think my colleagues have already explained a number of examples of how manufacturing firms have supported our needs during this crisis. And given the magnitude of the crisis, governments around the world have really opened their wallet and provided support across all sectors. But particularly for manufacturing, there are some strategic considerations. So there's a lot of discussions, of course, about the need for large-scale manufacturing capacity to produce this vaccine to everyone, for everyone, when they are available. And of course, there's also a lot of discussion in many countries around the need to reduce the reliance on imports, particularly for personal protective equipment and PPE, such as this statement from the OECD and the German government. But these are really statements around the immediate emergency response. In the longer term, there's also discussions in countries like Australia and like Korea on the role of manufacturing for long-term economic resilience. So in Australia, there is this discussion about manufacturing, the need for manufacturing to have a bigger contribution to the GDP. And in Korea, they are very clear that they were able to achieve this quicker economic rebound thanks to the pockets of economic resilience offered by manufacturing industries. So as part of our project, we're looking around the world, these kind of countries, and we're trying to identify and understand the policy responses, particularly focused on manufacturing. We have identified 5 pillars in this international policy agenda. The first one is emerging more resilient. So increasing the domestic supply of critical items today, but also thinking about how countries might become more disruption-proof in the long term. More sustainable, accelerating the development and deployment of green processes and products, given that the countries are already supporting industries quite significantly. Can we do this better? Can we emerge greener? More innovative, using science and technology, like the examples that Jag and Duncan have just explained, to rethink about the existing industries and also support the emergence of the industries of the future. So again, these considerations both at the short and long term. More global, as we have experienced supply and demand shocks, many countries are looking globally to access the new sources of growth and the new sources of suppliers. And more inclusive, there's huge recognition, of course, that the crisis affected different industries, regions, and workers in different ways. So efforts to address those disparities are coming up from around the world. Just to say, so obviously these categories overlap to a certain extent, but they have been useful for our analysis. I'll now give examples of each of these categories picking up from different countries. Just as a note of caution, many of these programs are new and we have not evaluated this program, so we cannot say this is something that needs to be done, but rather we're providing examples to stimulate the discussion and illustrate the variety of things that could be done. Emerging more resilient. So Tim already talked about these national task forces to respond to the need for protective equipment, for medical supplies. And Team Taiwan, the national teams set up in Taiwan are quite an interesting example. Many types of manufacturing industries, machine tool, medical equipment manufacturers, and technology research institutes coming together to really take Taiwan from being a net importer to a net exporter of masks. They tripled production in 6 weeks, this rapid response capability that Duncan and Jag were talking about. And the important thing is that, yes, we use this for the crisis, but now they're thinking how they might use this kind of capabilities at the national level to promote the industries of the future, for example, materials manufacturing. A lot of talk about reshoring support in countries like Korea and Japan, but also we need to keep in mind that that was already happening because of those trade disputes that I mentioned before. And a very interesting example from Singapore, even before the crisis, they were developing these industry transformation maps, really sector by sector roadmaps that take into account these mega trends in terms of disruptions, but also in terms of science and technology to identify new growth areas and where can the country be competitive in the long term. So yes, resilience in the short term, but also resilience in the long term for manufacturing industries. More sustainable technology investment roadmaps, very interesting ones being developed now in Australia. A lot of discussion on the national hydrogen strategy in Germany, and obviously well-funded. The Green New Deal in Korea that includes, very importantly, the funding for the construction of new green sites in the country, and things like stimulating demand for green goods through refunds for purchases, for example, of energy efficient appliances. More innovative, we have increasing funding for startups. Very present in media, these aerospace and automotive plants in France. You've seen very significant packages there. But what is interesting from this perspective is the emphasis on R&D and the idea of investing more in the technologies. And they talk about these future funds to really drive the future competitiveness through innovation of these industries. And again, the conditionality there, we're giving enough money, very open in France, saying we're giving a lot of money to these industries. We would like also for them to emerge in the more stronger in the future. Digital New Deals in Korea, again, properly funded to strengthen this, what they call the DNA data network and artificial intelligence, and create many jobs as well. More global, countries like Japan, using their embassies, their Department for Trade to support the expansion of the firms overseas, simplification of trade procedures in China, and the promotion of these K-quarantine products, again, was mentioned already by Jag. Since the Koreans have really scaled up this production capacity of things like test kits, but also masks, can we now use this as a potential growth opportunity for the country and export financing alongside that? And finally, more inclusive. So as mentioned, the effect is different for different types of firms and different types of workers. So job protection guarantees for disabled persons in China as a requirement to access the government support. Similar type of conditionality in Korea. They need to be spending the large companies with SMEs or the consumers with SMEs. Also inclusion in terms of digital inclusion. So you'll see in Singapore and other countries, making sure that the SMEs have the support and senior workers have the support to be able to use digital technologies through advisory services, yes, but also through grants for purchasing digital solutions. And again, many of these is the reconfiguration and further funding of existing initiatives. So we're going to have more details of all these programs and all these categories in our report, but just for the last 2 minutes of my presentation, I would like to discuss a couple of implications for the UK, particularly in the context of the ongoing discussions on the future of industrial strategy in the country. So first thing is in our view, the need for a clearer articulation of this strategic role of manufacturing capabilities in short-term and long short, medium, and long terms. Of course, manufacturing has been very active, ramping up this production to make sure that we had food, that we had medicines, repurposing lines, and all the examples that Tim mentioned to produce life-saving goods. But also in the longer term, and I think that's probably where more discussion is needed, is in identify the role of manufacturing as a driver of this national economic recovery, as manufacturing as the source of these pockets of economic resilience. And very interesting discussions. Let's remind ourselves the discussions that happened in the last crisis, 2008, 2009 crisis. Many countries thinking about what is the right balance of the different sectors in the economy, and within that, what is the right contribution of manufacturing industries. You might remember that after this crisis, a couple of countries like Japan and Singapore specifically had plans to increase the share of manufacturing in the GDP because precisely of the resilience of the sector economically in the long term. Secondly, perhaps the clearer distinction between the different policy needs of different industries. There has been a lot of discussion about the need for manufacturing distribution capacity of critical goods, critically very important, extremely important, but really, the estimation of the World Trade Organization is that these manufacturing goods, in terms of trade, last year, they represented around 2% of manufacturing trade. So the larger share of manufacturing goods really is outside those. So there needs to be, obviously, a discussion on the rejuvenation and reinvention needs of the industries going forward. There's a lot of lessons that have been discussed already for that. And finally, as the future industrial strategy in this country is discussed, I think there is a clearer recognition, and we have seen that from our colleagues in government, of the need for this manufacturing evidence, understanding better the supply chain risks and vulnerabilities across different sectors, because they're very different across different sectors, the domestic supply, industrial capabilities and networks, who can we work with in the need to respond rapidly and to think about the future industries, and the role of these innovation institutions, like the Catapult centers here in the UK and other innovation institutions, in supporting industries across different regions of the country. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Carlos, and thank you to all of our speakers for their fascinating insights into repurposing, the supply chain challenges, automation, and indeed the policy responses. So let's move into the panel discussion and try and answer as many questions as we can. I've got one to kick things off. So I suppose in many respects, different manufacturing sectors have had a different experience over the past few months. Some sectors have seen a dramatic reduction in output, whereas others have been struggling to match demand. So I'd be interested to hear the panel's discussions on which sectors are best placed to recover from this crisis, and which potentially are most vulnerable moving forward. Can I go to Tim first? Can we get your perspective on that, please?
Sure, happy to kick things off. I guess, no surprise, seeing the way in which elements of the fulfillment on the food side have responded very impressively is interesting. I mean, Ocado, you can just look at their share price, see what's been happening there. So those firms that have capabilities that absolutely align with the way production, distribution and consumption is going, absolutely have responded very well to that. It's then the ability to continue to scale those activities in these rather difficult times. I guess the other issue relates to the fact that firms who are able who are operating in an area where demand is increasing in this rather strange environment at the moment, can they access sufficient skills to actually enable them to do this? I think there's an interesting thing about those who were positioned well within this, whereas those who just through no fault of their own will struggle. So the aerospace industry, you know, if flights stop, clearly that has we've seen a very dramatic effect on all aspects of the aerospace industry. And so I guess it's those two things. It's those who were naturally geared for a world such as this, as part of, and also as part of where the world is heading anyway, whereas those who are just in a sector that is inherently likely to suffer when a situation like this strikes. And I guess the very concerning thing is then, how do we ensure that the investment continues to not only ensure the survival of those firms in particular sectors, but also to position them to be better able to respond in the future, linking very strongly to points made by, in particular, Jag and Carlos in the last few comments there. So I think those are the two issues to me. It's how do we support those who are naturally aligned with what's going on now, give them what they need, but also support the survival and then recovery of those who, through no fault of their own, were in a different sector.
And off the back of that, Carlos, Alan Griffiths has asked whether or not you expect to see government stimulus for specific sectors to help them weather the storm. And if you do, what sectors do you think might receive such a package of support?
I suppose we have seen, definitely. I mean, I mentioned the cases of France, very clearly, the automotive and aerospace support packages. We have seen the similar strategies around the world. I mentioned also the case of the industry transformation maps in Singapore. Those are sector by sector. And within manufacturing, you have around 7 subsectors, and there is a study and specifically mechanisms for each of them. In the UK, of course, we have heard recently announcements related to aerospace, to auto, and we are obviously just hearing some of the new thinking in the government. Now, in terms, I think I would just like to link to the previous question, because I mean, what we've seen, one of the issues is which sector needs more support, I guess, to address that question. What we've seen during the crisis is that some sectors like production, transport equipment, were more affected, whereas sectors obviously like chemicals, pharmaceutical, food were not that affected. There was just a report released by MEC UK a couple of days ago, I think, and the forecast is that for 2020, the only one sector that will have subsector, manufacturing subsector, that will experience growth in the UK is pharma. And they consider that, yeah, motor vehicles will be one of the most affected, together with textile and mechanical industries. So I will related to that, I would expect that government support definitely will have to look specifically at those sectors that are being most affected, which I also mentioned in my presentation regarding the inclusivity of the support.
Jag, what's your perspective on who's maybe going to need a little bit of help to weather this storm, and which ones are maybe best placed to recover?
Well, we spent a lot of time talking about supply, but I think for me, generating demand in some sectors is going to be crucial. So we may see supply chains come back alive, but the demand has disappeared. And I think trying to get a sense of getting that balance again that we talked about during the presentations of supply and demand. I think going and looking at particular sectors where we may think about support in 3 horizons: short, medium, and long term. So short term, I think, is about getting through this bumpy period. Hopefully it doesn't extend. But then moving into the medium and long term is maybe nations need to think again around what are the essential industries. Is it okay to have 80–90% of your medicines imported? for example. And this is the UK issue. I've seen in the chat some conversations around, developed and developing nations. But, in the US, you see also huge importation. If I look at the food supply chain, 50 to 70% of food is imported and traded. So we are, the forces of globalization have been around for a while. They're not going to disappear overnight. So I see those supply chains that are more international, it's trying to support that supply and demand and trying to smooth that as far as possible. Would be maybe one of the roles both industry and government can play. But just to share one anecdote from a major manufacturer in mainland Europe. 3 weeks ago, they were planning on, at best, 80% of their demand coming through that they expected. Last week, they can't meet demand because it's gone, it's ahead of even their best expectations. So this volatility that we're seeing is actually quite difficult to predict, even 1-2 months out, never mind long term.
Duncan, do you see the application of industrial software and automation helping particular sectors through this crisis? And if so, which ones do you think might respond to automation soonest? So,
interesting comment, Johnny. I mean, the first point I'd say is I think, if you're talking about sector, I'm not sure if we call it a classic manufacturing sector, but the digital systems sector is definitely doing pretty well. If we're encompassing all commercial as well as industrial digital solutions, and I expect them to continue to do well as people, are looking for ways in which they can use digital solutions to enhance, or at least actually be able to get back to doing something rather like what they were doing before. So I think, before the COVID crisis, we were heavily involved in looking at the role of digital systems in enhancing SME operations. And I think, those parts of SME operations that don't continue to be heavily manual are going to suffer quite heavily under the constrained movements over the next 6 to 9 months. And so it may be that there's a significant benefit for deploying digital systems, not in a particular sector, but in particular classes of operations. Equally, those sectors where there's a quite heavy footfall in the manufacturing operations would be ones that will benefit significantly from digital solutions. It's a little bit hard to generalize into a sector, but the automotive industry has probably got a heavier footfall than most. Food industry has a heavy footfall. So they may be two of the sectors that could get examined in that context.
Sticking with you, Duncan, I think this is a really timely, important question. The amount of disruptions manufacturers have faced over the last 20 years, the financial crash, the volcanic ash cloud, the Fukushima natural disaster, the flooding in Taiwan, they've long been told to get a better visibility and transparency across their supply chain, in many cases through digital solutions. They've been told that for many, many years, but progress has been slow. What do you think will be different this time? Do you think the message finally might get through?
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting point. I mean, I've probably been working on supply chain tracking systems for 20 odd years, and my sense is the technology to do supply chain tracking has always existed. There is the issue around visibility is an interesting one, because actually you don't need to know where everything is all the time. You just need to know where the things are that you need to make decisions about at any given time. But one of the major barriers that we see around supply chain visibility is not a technology one. It's an agreement to share data, and perhaps there is some barriers or concerns about security and confidentiality in doing so. But I mean, I think one of the things that we often forget is that supply chain data is a kind of competitive weapon. So getting companies to share data about visibility may, may change their competitive stance. So there is a concern about that. But from my point of view, there may be some significant gains. Now, if we talk about, say, the PPE supply chain specifically, there may be specific requirements for greater visibility and for data sharing that just gets forced through, which may not have been forced through previously. And perhaps also in the food industry as well, where we need to be guaranteeing some sort of traceability information about food supplies. That may well be the case as well.
Tim, going to you. You mentioned reshoring in your presentation, and it seems to be a growing trend. But is the UK in a strong position, a dominant position, to undergo a mass reshoring exercise? And if it's not, I suppose what needs to be put in place?
Ooh, that's a question with lots of angles to it. Thank you for that. I guess one of the, to just that point, is an assumption that reshoring is a good thing. As I guess the reason I'm hesitating slightly in giving a quick answer is there are so many aspects to that, and it massively depends on what well, there's the general concept, but also are we talking about the type of product? Within that product, is it a complex product or a simple product? Is it a product at the beginning of its life cycle versus something that's more mature? So just a quick example, when we had the shortage of PPE, people said, well, wouldn't it have been fantastic just to reshore the manufacturing of PPE to the UK? You go, well, not necessarily, because those are very simple products produced in huge volumes by people who are extremely good at it at locations where they can optimize for cost and quality. Why would you reshore something like that? It doesn't necessarily make sense. Whereas something that is at the beginning of its life cycle, perhaps something that's more closely linked to being a more innovative product, a more complex product, a newer product, you may well say, well, actually, there's a logic to saying perhaps we should retain a bit more of that. Back to the argument about industrial commons. But the trouble is, if it's just a simple, should we reshore more question, it's impossible to answer, because it's impossible to answer. But I think if you break it down into different product types, different industry sectors, and different reasons for doing it. So some may be, this is a critical thing, we perhaps should retain it, versus it would be nice if there was another crisis that we probably should be able to make something like this, to we're responding to a very different agenda where it feels right to do it back in the UK for all sorts of reasons. I see there are a number of points being raised about Brexit. So again, business decisions being made in the light of a complex changing world make it almost impossible for me to answer the question about should we be doing more about reshoring. But I think we need to be asking better questions about it along the lines I just articulated.
Jag, one of the advantages of reshored production or locally sourced production is the, I suppose, intangible benefits it offers in terms of maybe fairly paid labour costs, output delivered through renewable, sustainable energy. How can these sorts of intangible elements be costed into a global supply chain? So it's not just about the base cost, I suppose.
Thanks, Johnny, for that. I guess if we really look at globalization and reshoring within that context, it has been dominated by a cost agenda. And as products become more commodities, indeed, the quality challenge is often becomes secondary. So it's purely a cost game. And I think, Tim alluded to the issue about the nature of the product and its life cycle. But I think going back to my talk, this issue around sustainability and the carbon footprint wasn't really dominant in previous international location decisions. I think the question about resilience was starting to emerge as a topic pre-COVID, because we've had issues about extreme weather, we've had trade issues between US and China, for example. And we also saw during the pandemic was that countries where you would expect free supply even within Europe, was becoming restrictive. I saw in the food supply chains, the biggest exporters of wheat and rice slap export bans within weeks. So these are big exporters who are actually saying, we're not going to supply internationally. So I think these new factors, which have played a hugely secondary role, will now come into the decision-making agenda. And I think we'll therefore get different decisions. That doesn't mean everything will be reshored. I don't think that's likely or even desirable. But I think we will have more informed decisions around strategic supplies and strategic stock holding, where local manufacturing actually makes sense because of the life cycle of the product, because of the technology intensity, and maybe more robust trading norms, so that in a crisis, actually products should go where they're needed the most, and maybe an international a convention that observes that. There were a lot of private deals going on in the last few months between governments. One major household product, in medicine, was very close to running out in the UK and required a government-to-government conversation. So, I mean, we ran close to the wire in some areas, and that'll force a rethink.
We've had a number of questions all around investment and financing. So, Carlos, I'm going to go to you because someone's picked up on your presentation and said that some of the changes you were talking about require the investment community to take a longer term view of returns expected from manufacturers? I've spoken to many of them, that many manufacturers who say that the kind of drive to produce a dividend to shareholders is kind of counterintuitive to maybe some of their long-term investment plans.
Yes, I think this is a topic that has been discussed a lot in the policy community. The financialization of manufacturing definitely is a big elephant in the room when we're talking about resilience, without really addressing these incentives, these pervasive incentives around the financialization of manufacturing that pushes companies to go for share buyback and overlooking innovation investments or rainy day preparations. We will not really have resilience. I mean, just one example, there were some discussions of, as you may know, some smaller companies in Germany and Japan tend to be use that longer term perspective, especially rainy day preparation, savings really, right? So, you know, typically they will call them the cash hoarders. But, you know, companies like Keyence in Japan will, you know, boast about their ability to pay their employees for a decade without receiving any income, and then that was really dismissed in the past. But now those kind of rainy day preparations in manufacturing as well are definitely something that needs to be looked at. And yeah, definitely the financialization, the long-term pension capital that needs to be there. And as I mentioned in the presentation, there are some conditionalities very clear in countries like France, that as companies receive the support, and also even here in the UK, there's discussion about, yes, the companies will receive this kind of bailout or grants from government, but they cannot use them to pay bonuses, to buy shares back. So there is certain conditionality there. So really to establish what the concept here was, the sector deals, real sector deals in which, yes, now there's emergency support, but what can the sectors provide as well in the long term?
Duncan, we've had a couple of technology-focused questions, one about 5G and one about blockchain, effectively asking, do you think COVID will accelerate the adoption and the importance of both blockchain and 5G?
So, okay, I mean, they're pretty separate. Well, it's debatable whether the blockchain is a technology so much, but I think blockchain will come back to that comment I was making about traceability earlier on, and the issue that one of the main barriers is data sharing. And certainly an application area for blockchain has been around distributed data sharing. So data sharing in which there's not an individual organisation that's managing data as a central repository, but allowing for distributed data management. So blockchain and I guess all the different distributed ledger technologies may be a mechanism for enabling that. 5G is an interesting one. I mean, in some ways, 5G is not giving us anything that's revolutionary. And I know a lot of 5G people will be in shock as I say that. But, it's actually allowing us to get network access better than we have in the past, with much more timely responses, fewer latencies, and allowing for greater bandwidths. But I think there are some potential gains for that, because one of the benefits for 5G is that perhaps you can actually bypass having a local network and actually make use of the existing infrastructure of the telcos and just connect things directly to 5G and run your operations in that way. And that might just provide a lower entry point to organisations that haven't been historically significantly investing in IT infrastructure within their business.
We've had a question, and it's got a great wording, this citizen supply chain, which I'd never heard before, but I think it's a fantastic concept. And obviously the citizen supply chain has played a critical role in the production of PPE over the past 2 or 3 months. Tim, let's go to you. Do you think that this concept of a citizen supply chain can actually be leveraged in a regular day-to-day sector? Does it have a role to play?
It's a great question, and it actually has appeared several times way before the crisis. So there was a project being done by colleagues at the Royal College of Art, looking at the role of sort of make spaces and communities of makers coming together as part of local supply chains, and looked at what was happening there. But I guess we see the value of it in a crisis for 2 reasons. One is it can deliver things on a hyper-local basis, which is very good. And it also provides a very positive response to something that was otherwise extremely negative. If, however, you look at the combined outputs of, say, I don't know, face visors from all of the community projects across the country, which was fantastic, if you compare that to what a single manufacturing company could produce in perhaps, a very short period of time, it's nowhere near it. So it's not an efficient, if you just take it as brutally efficient. Is it an efficient way of doing things? Not particularly. Is it a useful way of doing things? In specific situations, yes. And as you say, in a crisis, really interesting and really useful. So one of the ways it can be used outside is it perhaps could form part of the innovation side of things. So again, we have a student looking at this issue of how community making projects can be part of the entrepreneurial ecosystem. So when you're doing a startup, you want to start making something. How do you make your first minimal viable product? Well, the sort of the citizen supply chain maker communities can form a valuable part of that. So I think it is very valuable in a crisis and has proved itself to be so. I think in more normal times, you take a different slant on it. It's more perhaps about the innovation side of things rather than the production of standard goods.
Thank you. We are running out of time a little bit. So just to close things off, I'd like to run down the panel, and if they could offer their perspective, their insight on what the future of manufacturing is. Not an easy ask, I appreciate. But Jag, let's go to you first. And this panel discussion was called "The Future of Manufacturing in the Wake of COVID-19." So what does that future look like from your perspective?
There are some changes which have accelerated, where I may have envisaged something taking 5 or 10 years that will have happened in the last 3 or 4 months. And if I just pick on the growth of e-commerce and the connectivity with the consumer, I think consumers have become comfortable now engaging and driving the supply chains they want, the channels they operate. My food service provider was a furloughed worker who set up 3 months ago. His digital platform's better than the competition. So that level of innovation is driving like e-commerce change. I can't remember the last time I used a pound note. Some people say that's a habit, but I would say, you know, that cashless society, some parts of the world are very cash driven, and I think that will have gone through a step change.
Carlos, what about your perspective on what the future of manufacturing looks like?
I will perhaps respond from the policy perspective. In terms, I think there is definitely, and we have seen now in the crisis, that the government has had to intervene. The support that the government has provided has been extraordinary. And I think going forward, defining this future of manufacturing will really depend on our ability as the manufacturing community to articulate the strategic role of manufacturing. Let's make this crisis different. Let's make sure that we don't forget this strategic role, because we had a crisis. Yes, manufacturing very important. It really helped the recovery. We really need to think about the strategic sourcing and rapid reconfiguration capabilities, but very quickly that was taken out from the discussion. So I think I will invite everybody to make sure that those lessons learned in this crisis are properly articulated and pushed forward as the future of industrial strategy is defined.
Absolutely, yeah, and fingers crossed that happens. Duncan, your comments. I think you're muted at the moment.
Johnny, I'm really sorry. I lost the sound for about a minute, and I didn't know you were targeting me. Listen again.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, this panel's called The Future of Manufacturing. So what do you think that future looks like?
I think at the moment it looks positive. I think my sense is we're probably, it's positive that now we're going to go through some sort of pragmatic adjustment as the economic deficits hits in. But I think in the longer term, we're seeing a need for more manufacturing rather than less manufacturing. So I think it will actually be positive in the longer term for manufacturing as a whole, but for the UK manufacturing particularly, I see there being lots of interesting opportunities now that didn't exist 6 months ago.
Absolutely. And Tim, it's down to you for the closing thoughts.
Oh dear, worrying. Everything smart's been said already. I guess just picking up on other people's thoughts, that's always a good start. I think there's something really interesting about perhaps the way manufacturing will be increasingly integrated into local and regional economies, even more so than it is already, because I think there's been something really, another positive from this horrific situation with COVID has been an increased profile and recognition of the importance of manufacturing and what it really is and what it really means. And maybe just touching very briefly, if I may, on a comment made by Thomas Sutton, who made the observation from the food sector that by reducing the number of products they had, so in other words, making things simpler for themselves, customers still get most of the products they want, but also it's allowed them to be more efficient and allow them to increase the greenness of their operations. So I think despite all this move to hyper customization and units of one for everybody, we might see something slightly different happening as people respond slightly counterintuitively to what they have been saying the trend has been.